The Subaltern Studies Group has developed a theory about how change happened in India during colonial times. They argue that this change can be seen as a shift from semi feudalism to capitalist control. This transformation marks the beginning of politicalness for the colonized people, driven by parts of the indigenous elite who are often called bourgeois nationalists. Instead of viewing these changes as smooth transitions, the group believes we should see them as multiple confrontational movements. These changes are marked by shifts in how societies understand and use signs and symbols. A key idea is that a significant change in a sign system or the way meaning is assigned to things often comes with violence and crisis. Even if the change seems gradual, incomplete, or reversed, it is driven by a crisis. This shift in meaning adds a new layer to the previous understanding, filling in gaps and addressing failures in the original science system. The Subaltern Studies Group sees their work as creating a theory of culture and consciousness rather than just a theory of historical change. Their approach is somewhat like deconstruction, which challenges and questions existing oppositions and categories. For them, a theory of change involves understanding how signs and meanings shift over time and how these shifts impact our reading of history. This process, which involves moving between past and future understandings, is what Gramsci referred to as elaboration or working things out. Spivak discusses the concept of cognitive failure in historical analysis. This means that failures in understanding or interpreting history are not just about the level of awareness within a class or group. Instead, these cognitive failures are a fundamental part of how history is recorded and understood. Both nationalist and colonialist histories are shaped by these failures. This is clear in how different groups, subaltern, insurgent, nationalist, and colonialist groups, are treated in historical accounts. Measuring historical success or failure by the level of consciousness of a class is too simplistic. The most effective historical accounts, according to the Subaltern Studies Group, are those that acknowledge and work through cognitive failures. For the subaltern, consciousness and culture are central, while for the elite, culture and manipulation play a key role. Despite their differences, all these groups are involved in the process of cognition or understanding. Cognitive failure is a persistent issue. Elite histories and bourgeois nationalist accounts are built on these very failures. The Subaltern Studies Group aims to align with deconstruction to challenge and question the authority of the historian without becoming paralyzed by the process. They strive to turn impossible conditions into possibilities by recognizing and addressing failures in their work. If they ignore these implications for fear of being politically incorrect, they risk objectifying the subaltern and controlling their narrative rather than genuinely restoring their agency and self-determination. Spivak explores the work of a group of scholars who study and try to uncover what is called subaltern consciousness, specifically focusing on the awareness and perspectives of peasants or marginalized groups. Initially, their project might seem straightforward, like they are just trying to document and understand the thoughts and actions of these groups. However, the way they interpret this consciousness is influenced by their own perspectives and ideas. Consciousness in this context refers to the awareness and sense of identity that people have, and it is considered a fundamental aspect that shapes how we understand anything in the world, particularly in Western thought after the Enlightenment. The Subaltern Studies approach to understanding subaltern consciousness is shaped by a specific way of thinking. They see things like peasant action in times of famine or rebellion as reflecting a single unified consciousness or awareness that these groups have. For them, when peasants come together in solidarity, it is a sign of this underlying consciousness. But this interpretation is complex. There is a contradiction in this way of thinking because consciousness is not just a general concept. It is something that is deeply historical and political, specific to the time and place in which it exists. Therefore, subaltern consciousness is not just any consciousness, but one that is shaped by the specific historical and political circumstances of the marginalized groups. Spivak challenges the traditional way of understanding consciousness, especially in documents written by elites or those in power, such as texts about counterinsurgency. These texts are often the only sources we have that talk about the consciousness of subaltern groups. However, they come biases and reflect the perspectives of those in power, not the peasants themselves. As a result, the true perspective of the peasants, their understanding of their struggles is often lost or difficult to recover. The only way we can sometimes glimpse their consciousness is by looking at how actions caused a sense of crisis among those in power. So when we see evidence of rebellion or resistance, we can interpret it as an indication that there was indeed a strong consciousness among the subaltern groups, even if it is not fully captured in the historical record. Understanding subaltern consciousness is not about finding a common identity, but rather about recognizing differences. The subaltern groups represent the demographic difference between the majority of the Indian population and the elites. So when we talk about retrieving or understanding subaltern consciousness, it is about identifying and acknowledging these differences, which might be referred to in post-structuralist terms as the subaltern subject effect. The subaltern studies group, which the text discusses, places their ideas within a broader debate in West Marxism. Some Marxists, especially when looking at societies before capitalism fully developed, argue that subaltern groups did not have a class consciousness in the same way that workers in capitalist societies did. This is especially true in the context of imperialism, where traditional class structure does not apply in the same way. The subaltern studies group challenges this view, particularly arguing against historians like E.J. Hobsbawm, who referred to the actions of these groups as pre-political and saw agrarian laborers and peasants in Asia as not involved in class conflict until much later. They also critique attempts to impose a Western Marxist idea of class consciousness onto these groups. There arises a confusion when trying to connect the work of the subaltern studies group with critics of humanism like Barthes and Foucault, especially because of their different uses of the concept of consciousness. While critics might focus on how consciousness is shaped by power and knowledge, the subaltern studies group seems to strategically hold on to an essentialist idea of consciousness to make their historical analysis. This approach, however, is not immune to critique from anti-humanist perspectives, which challenge the idea that consciousness is a fixed essential identity. Spivak discusses the idea of unwitting strategies in subaltern studies, suggesting that even theories that allow for some unpredictability in how strategies are formed can still be subject to their own limitations. The scholars involved in subaltern studies might end up reinforcing the very subalternity they aim to analyze by claiming a positive identity for the subaltern as part of a broader strategy. This acknowledges that the subaltern's emergence into political power is always going to be complex and not fully captured by traditional historical analysis. Spivak reminds this relationship between theory and practice, particularly in Marx's famous statement that philosophers have interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Spivak argues that theoretical descriptions can never create universal truths, but can only offer temporary generalizations which are still important. Subaltern studies should recognize that its work is not about fully capturing or representing some consciousness, but about understanding that this consciousness is always in a flux and never fully accessible to historians. The project of subaltern studies is about recognizing their own limitations in trying to understand the uneven and complex ways in which the subaltern groups enter political power. Spivak discusses various philosophical and historical approaches, focusing on how different thinkers view the relationship between knowledge, power, and the experiences of the marginalized groups, particularly in the context of subaltern studies. Althusser argued that philosophy could be transformed and in turn help change the world by adopting new practices. E.P. Thompson, a historian, criticized Althusser's approach, favoring the British style of history, which emphasizes detailed historical analysis over the French style of philosophy that Althusser represented. Thompson believed that history and philosophy should remain distinct and not try to directly align with the experiences of marginalized groups or subaltern social practices. Foucault took a different approach by refusing to represent oppressed people directly, instead suggesting that these subjects could speak for themselves. Spivak highlights the tension between post-Marxist anti-humanism from the First World and the history of imperialism. This tension is not just about expanding the range of possibilities for understanding the world, as suggested by Partha Chatterjee. While Foucault was a brilliant thinker who explored how power operates across different spaces, Spivak argues that he did not fully account for the effects of imperialism on these spaces. The idea of sovereignty or the power of the state is especially important in regions impacted by imperialism, where the control of land and resources became central to the new forms of power that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. When discussing the unified consciousness of the subaltern, that is, the collective awareness and the identity of marginalized groups, we should adopt the strategies of history. At the same time, when discussing the specific localized experiences of these groups, we should consider the ideas of anti-humanist thinkers who criticize traditional notions of human identity and knowledge. The remarks of Ranajit Guha and Althusser represent not a contradiction but a reflection on the different levels at which philosophy operates and the strategic differences in their approaches. An important point here is the recognition of the interconnectedness of the new ideas and traditional or original ones in subaltern studies. This involves breaking down the division between the scholars studying the subaltern themselves, as well as recognizing that these scholars draw on anti-humanist models even as they critique them. Spivak suggests that subaltern studies could benefit from connecting with other movements like the independent peasant movement in Mexico to further enrich their analysis. Post-structuralist anti-humanism, a theoretical approach, critiques the idea of a stable subject of knowledge, the belief that we can fully know and categorize everything. This approach questions the desire to create exhaustive systems of classification and naming, which often stem from the assumption spoken language directly represents our thoughts and consciousness, while writing is just a secondary reflection of speech. This way of thinking is problematic because it suggests that real, deliberate thought is limited to conscious, empirical evidence, ignoring the complexities of how meaning is produced. According to post-structuralist theory, both spoken and written language are distanced from the self, meaning that all forms of expression create a gap between what is meant and what is actually said or written. This idea is linked to the concept of alienation, where the self is seen as something that is always in the process of being created rather than a fixed foundation. Writing, in particular, is seen as having a lasting impact that breaks away from its original context and creates new meanings. Spivak uses the concept of rumor in subaltern context to illustrate how marginalized groups create their own forms of communication, which might be more fittingly understood as illegitimate writing rather than the authoritative writing of the law. Peasants' beliefs are shaped by phonocentrism, a tradition that values spoken word over written text, similar to how historians are influenced by Western linguistic traditions. Spivak suggests that this is more about complicity, a mutual involvement, rather than a clear distance between knowledge and belief. The Subaltern Studies group, which focuses on the history and experiences of marginalized, highlights how the structure of writing controlled by subaltern phonocentrism opens up revolutionary possibilities. This allows the scholars to access the detailed, minute scale functioning of the subaltern's world. The text contrasts newspapers seen as exploitative writing with spoken, which is viewed as a more authentic representation of the speaker's thoughts and consciousness. Not all ways of understanding and acting in the world are equally rooted in metaphysical or phonocentric thinking. A careful reader can reveal the differences between the three groups: historians, philosophers, and anti-humanists. But this analysis must always be strategic and responsive to practical needs. For the Subaltern Studies group, this approach helps avoid the danger of claiming to fully understand or represent the truth of the subaltern's consciousness. Spivak discusses the role of women in the discourse of male insurgents, particularly in the culture of sugarcane in eastern Uttar Pradesh. Spivak argues that femininity holds a similar meaning and influence across different groups, as meticulously documented by Gyanendra Pandey. On a deep cultural level, deities are represented as man-eating goddesses, and sacrifices are more often made to these goddesses than to gods. Spivak explores the complex social dynamics between these revered goddesses and secular women like daughters and widows who are not seen as acceptable leaders. Spivak then examines the role of women in the historical accounts of male insurgents, focusing on the culture of sugarcane in eastern Uttar Pradesh. It questions how the subaltern, those marginalized or oppressed, are represented and how women influence this representation. Particularly in works like Guha's peasant insurgency, territoriality, how people relate to and organize within their land and community, is a key concept. This involves a mix of deep-rooted kinship ties and community bonds that drive autonomous action. In these historical examples, the exchange of women is highlighted as a way to strengthen kinship ties across different religious groups. This exchange is crucial for understanding the social dynamics of the time. Spivak aims to reveal how the Subaltern Studies group and their subjects, that is, the subaltern, are interconnected. Historians often interpret aspects like sexual difference as related to class or caste solidarity, rather than recognizing the unique role of gender. This oversight has led to an assumption of shared ancestry and communal solidarity, while simultaneously enforcing discriminatory practices against outsiders. Territoriality, or how people organize and control their land, played a role in limiting resistance to British colonial rule. This control was necessary for maintaining the status quo. Today, the concepts of nationhood and development are being re-examined. As the global economy becomes more computerized, countries previously considered underdeveloped are integrating differently into the international market. Instead of just exporting raw materials and labor, there is now a focus on manufacturing, leading to the rise of export processing zones. These zones offer incentives to the multinational corporations and often challenge traditional ideas of national sovereignty. In this global context, urban sub-proletarian women, those who are part of the working poor in cities, are seen as the key example of how global capitalism intersects with existing patriarchal structures. This intersection has led to new questions about how subaltern women are defined and represented. Partha Chatterjee's idea of communal power is important here. He argues that traditional communal structures based on family still play a significant role in the pre-capitalist world, influencing how power is organized and exercised. Spivak discusses how concepts of territoriality and communal power are reflected in the roles women play as daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. These roles are often used to uphold patriarchal traditions, even as women's identities and roles are minimized or disregarded. The continuity of community or history is maintained by masking the ways in which women's roles and meanings are diminished. The gap between older structuralist theories and modern anti-humanism can be seen in the work of two influential theorists, Claude Lévi-Strauss and Derrida. Lévi-Strauss argued that marriage rules and kinship systems should be seen as part of language and representation, rather than as fixed roles. Derrida on the explored the limits of traditional meanings and concepts, particularly in relation to sexual difference and gender conflict. Post-structuralist thought suggests that all academic work is inherently influenced by previous ideas and can never be completely objective. This means that both critics, like historians, and their subjects, such as the subaltern, are always involved in a process of mutual influence and interpretation. The chain of complicity, that is, how ideas and representations are interconnected, continues beyond the end of an academic essay or